Welcome to another episode of Chasing Billy. It is about 2:40 in the morning on Saturday night here, West Virginia time. Um, we are pre-recording an episode for tomorrow, Sunday. Well, I guess it's today now, Sunday, May 26th. We were supposed to have Doss on, Doss Boot. We were going to talk about Pat Garrett and just go over some ideas about how his image has evolved and go over some aspects of his life and things like that. But unfortunately, sometimes real life requirements and desires and opportunities get in the way. And that happened with me this week. I am a musician and I play guitar, and I was drafted into playing guitar for a musical here in town, and I really wanted to do it. I really like theater, and just wanted to jump at the chance. And unfortunately, we have a practice here in about 12 hours. So I won't be able to make the live show time, unfortunately. So I had to reschedule with Doss. We're going to try to come at you next Sunday and talk about Pat Garrett. So forgive my rambling tonight. I had 2 gigs today for music. I got home a little late, but we work tirelessly to get the show to you. And I thought I would just put in the hard work tonight and try to deliver something so you guys have something to watch during the Sunday Billy, uh, you know, whatever you want to call it, gospel hour or some such. But yeah, so one thing that I was kind of interested in watching Josh and Jeremiah do the show last week is they started talking about Billy's origins again. And I know we talk about this a lot, and to me it's a subject of eternal speculation and research. It's something that really excuse me, pulled me in to the Billy world initially, and it's something that still fuels me and gets me interested in trying to find the missing pieces of where Billy came from, who his parents were, and things like that. And so I was really kind of bummed I couldn't take part in that discussion between Josh and Jeremiah last week, which I thought was really fascinating and well done. So I thought this kind of pre-recorded video would be a good time and opportunity for me to talk about my thoughts on where Billy came from, his parents' names, and that kind of thing. So it's going to be a lot of rambling. And unfortunately, with research, at least the way I do it, I'm going to be jumping dates, I'm going to be jumping places to try to put all the pieces that we have together in a semi-coherent manner, but it's not going to be that coherent because it's 2:45 in the morning and it's me, and I'm rarely coherent anyway. So I'll do my best. But here's what I think about where Billy came from, and here's why I think it. And I'll show you some clippings from newspapers and sources and things like that when I could obtain them. But, sometimes I'll just have to tell you where to look. But hopefully we can learn something new. And if you get the inkling to do some research on your own, maybe some of this that I share tonight will kind of lead you down new avenues, and maybe you'll find something, and we'll all celebrate together once we put this puzzle together. And maybe that'll take a lot of the joy out of it. But the mystery and the chase is part of the big reason a lot of us do the research, but that doesn't diminish my drive to find this stuff out at all. So yeah, it's not surprising or climactic or anticlimactic or anything that I think Billy the Kid was born in New York. And I'll give you the reasons I think that, and I'll try to share some stuff with you here on my screen for why I think that. And I've got a few different sources. The thing is, when you say Billy was from New York, anybody that disagrees with you will say that that's just based upon Pat Garrett and that you're just taking Garrett's word for it and that Ash Upson made it up. There's no doubt a lot of stuff that Upson and Garrett made up in that book, in The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. But I don't think New York is one of them because we just have too many folks from too many sources talking about it. And again, I don't even think I've exhausted all of it here. But I've provided as much as I could for why I think it was New York. And as an aside, to kind of like do a little sub note here or a footnote, I don't think Billy's parents were Patrick McCarty and Katherine Devine. There is no reason to connect Billy the Kid, Henry McCarty, to anybody named Patrick McCarty. The only source for that is a photostatic or, Xeroxed photo image type thing of a birth certificate that says Patrick McCarty and Katherine, maybe Devine, maybe McCarty, born Henry McCarty. I think it's in September of 1859. It's a record from a Catholic church, and so far we can't source it. We can't say that it came from this church or that it can't be produced. So until, in my opinion, it can be produced, it's not really worth giving a lot of weight, especially because other birth certificates and newspaper articles have been fabricated in the past, and I just don't want to give it a lot of weight. And that's the only thing that links our Billy the Kid to this Patrick McCarty and Katherine Devine. And unfortunately, that whole theory has made its way into sources and authoritative places and semi-authoritative places like Wikipedia and things like that. I just don't buy it yet, and I'll give you the main reason here in a bit. But anyway, what do we know about where Billy the Kid was born, his youth, and his parents? And unfortunately, the very boring answer is we don't know a lot at all. So anybody who tells you they know for sure about where Billy was born or who his parents were, we don't know. And we're not going to know probably for a while until we find that missing piece of evidence that's the catalyst for breaking this whole case open. But I think for me, it's safe to assume that it's New York and that he was born to a Michael McCarty, not Patrick. And I'll dig into why I think that's so. First off, before Pat Garrett wrote and published his Authentic Life, there was another author who was working on a book about Billy while Billy was still alive. And by the time he finished it, Billy had been killed. And so when it was released, I think it was released, right before Pat's book. But it was The True Life of Billy the Kid. I think it was called. It was a dime novel. And the author it was attributed to was Don Henardo. But the guy's real name was John Woodruff Lewis. And he was just a prolific dime store novelist. And it'll take me a second to share my screen here. But the source for this is the Billy the Kid Reader by Fred Nolan. And he's the one who provides the author name and everything like that. And the best I can do in this case is give you an image of that clipping, which is right here. And let me see if I can zoom that in a little bit for you. He says in that dime novel that he wrote before Garrett published his book, Billy the Kid's true name was William McCarthy. He was born in the state of New York. Some have located his birthplace as the city of New York, but this is doubtless a mistake. In the year 1859 or 1860. So that's not quite an authoritative source. but it does show us that New York was being touted as a birthplace for Billy even before he was killed. Um, Again, this guy was working on his book while he was still alive, and he had to update it to include Billy's death. So let me get back to my notes here. That's the first source, and to me, the least important. That's why I started with it, so we could get it out of the way. And I'll move on here. Uh, the next one, of course, is the testimony of Pat Garrett. And Pat here, and I think maybe I can just leave this screen share up. In his authentic life, William H. Bonney, the hero of this history, was born in the city of New York, November 23rd, 1859. Not sure why Don Henardo in his dime novel was so convinced that it was the state of New York, but not New York City, and not sure why Pat and Ash Upson decided it was New York City. Kind of varies, but I suspect it was New York City, and we'll get into more of that. Next, if I've got the order right on these slides, we have the testimony of Sheriff Whitehill, Harvey Whitehill. Nope, I don't. Let me find Harvey, but I might just edit this out so there's not all this craziness. But I'll just go through the slides. But next slide up is the census from 1880 from Joe Antrim. And luckily it's highlighted here. Ancestry did that work for me. But here we have Antrim Joseph, 17 years old. But it says he's consistently throughout the census record says he was born in 1863 in New York. Curiously enough, in this census record, he says his father was born in New York and his mother was born in England. But the birthplace of New York is there for Billy's brother, who is quite probably younger than Billy, born in New York. So if they're still in New York when Joseph is born, highly likely that Billy was born in New York. Second, we have the census for Joe Antrim, Billy's brother. Joe always went by Antrim, too. He kept his stepfather's name. But we have here, and I suspect and I'm quite confident that this is the correct one. My researcher and friend, Susan Stevenson, I think disagrees with me and thinks that this is not the correct one. I, however, do think that this is correct, given the birthplace and birth date, but it also supports Joseph having the first name or middle name of Michael, which would be named after his father. But we have Antrim Michael J. He's a roomer, born April of 1863. So that puts a month on a birth month for Joe. So if we want to maybe narrow our record search for that, born in New York, and this time both parents are born in Ireland. So that's kind of a neat development and a good example of how census records change so much. In this one, he's a stockman working in cattle in 1880, just like his brother maybe. But that's very interesting. Up next, I can't find a census for Joe in 1910. So maybe someone else can, or maybe he just wasn't present for the census in 1910. But in 1920, here he is, Joseph Antrim, lodger. I believe this is at a hotel in Denver. He was a gambler, and he basically just lived at hotels. And he was a runner for poker games too. He would run back and forth to the various games. I think it would keep an eye out for the authorities when the gambling was illegal, things like that. Anyway, born in New York. So there's 3 instances that Joe Antrim, the brother of Billy the Kid, has had an opportunity to provide his birth state, and consistently every time it's been New York. So I thought that was a good exhibit to submit to this court of inquiry. This is an article from January 6, 1881. So Billy is still alive. And this article seems to know a lot about Billy. It gets a lot of things right. Of course, it does get some things wrong. It doesn't seem like the newspapers back then got much 100% right. But it, surprisingly enough, it gets a ton right. And it's pretty cool that it does. I just clipped, it's a pretty long article, but I just clipped the pertinent section. But William Bonney, alias the Kid, the leader of the band, is scarcely more than 20 years of age. Goes on to describe him: height, weight, complexion, got his 2 front teeth in there, all that good stuff. But down here towards the end, it says he was born in New York State, but his parents removed to Indiana when he was quite small, and thence to Arizona. Of course, we know he went from Indiana to Wichita, then most likely to Colorado, then to Silver City, and it was quite some time before Billy ended up in Arizona. There's a few stops in between there. But I thought it was very neat that in January of 1881, while the kid was still alive, this article places him as a New York native who also traveled to Indiana as his first stop after leaving New York. And that is January. Hold on, let me check. Let me make sure I get that date right. I think I said January 6th, but it's probably not right. Yes, it's January 22nd, 1881. And that's from the Bloomington Courier in Bloomington, Indiana. It was republished. I think the article has its origin in Las Vegas, but the date that the article gives for its original publication in Las Vegas is December 20th, and I can't locate that issue of any newspaper in December 20th of 1881. Maybe I looked wrong. I don't know. Maybe somebody can find it and see when it was originally published, and maybe it has some sort of indication in the original publication about who wrote it. In these republications across the nation, it doesn't include any authorship notes. But I thought this was a really strong piece of evidence that New York origin story of Billy and the placing of him in Indiana was going on even before his death. So that's a convincing piece for me. Next up, we have another clipping that cites Governor Wallace as a source for this Indiana and New York origin. And it says a New Mexico paper says Sheriff Pat Garrett of Lincoln County, who's been following Billy the Kid, overtook him on the 14th at Fort Sumner and shot him dead. The kid was about 22, and Wallace said recently that he was a native of this state, and this is from an Indiana paper, having lived for a time in Terre Haute. His name was McCarthy. So at this time, and let me give you the date for this. This was July 19th, 1881, and this is from the Indianapolis News, and it's on page 1 if anybody wants to look up but I think this is the whole clipping. But July 19th, 1881, just a few days after Billy got killed, Wallace, at least according to this paper, is saying that he was a native of Indiana, and maybe they just assumed that, having lived for a time in Terre Haute. So that's our first Terre Haute connection too. And I think that's really important. I subscribe to the fact that Billy probably spent most of his time in Indiana in Terre Haute. And I think a lot of our research should be directed towards that area. for looking for him. Next image. This is from a larger article, and it's biographical and mythological, but the section that concerns us, it says Billy disputes with Chisholm, and it's kind of telling the story of the Lincoln County War very horribly, and the aftermath and everything. And it said the general, which, speaking of Wallace, related the circumstances that led to the meeting, and he talks about the meeting with Billy the Kid, and he said he was born in New York, and his name was William Bonney, spelled Bonne. When a lad, he was brought to Indiana, and he was reared at Indianapolis and Terre Haute. So 2 locations in Indiana that I think are very substantial and carry a lot of weight for our research and our suppositions. And that's Indianapolis and Terre Haute, which we can place his mother in Indianapolis, as I'll show here in a bit, and a couple recollections of Billy being connected to Terre Haute. He went in 1876 and was then about 17 years of age. He went west in 1876, which is a little late, but curious that Wallace, who spoke with Billy, who had at least one extensive meeting with him, I think he had a couple more probably, reared at Indianapolis and Terre Haute. And this was the Des Moines Daily News out of Iowa, reprinted. And I think this was July 9th, 1900. And at this time, roughly 20 years after the fact, Wallace is talking a lot to newspapers around this time, kicking around his autobiography, I think. And it's caused some stirring and a lot of press blurbs. So, yeah, he's still claiming after 20 years that this is his story. It's Indianapolis, New York to Indiana. So, again, another, I think, reliable source that's not Pat Garrett. This is a guy who talked to Billy the Kid himself and would have no reason to fabricate the New York story. And we'll see more connections here in a minute. Up next, we have a very good piece, in my opinion. I know Jeremiah disagrees with me on this, but this is the recollection of the chief of police, C.E. Vandiver, who was a police officer in Terre Haute during the days that Billy the Kid was supposed to have been there. And what I find amazing about this, and I really don't want you all to overlook this, I think this is important because I don't know how it could have been mythologized this early. This article is from August 2nd, 1881. Billy was killed on July 14th. Newspapers started reporting it July 19th. So we've just got a matter of weeks, not even a whole month yet. And we have this article that says, Acting Chief of Police Vandiver remembers Billy the Kid well. He says that the name he went by when he lived here was McCarthy, and he thinks that his mother never lived here, but at Indianapolis. Vandiver arrested him 4 or 5 times, not particularly for the commission of any crime, but for being caught under suspicious circumstances in barns, stables, and other places. Billy, although but 11 or 12 years old, slightly built and effeminate, was a bad case, and Mr. Vandiver is not surprised at his final outcome. Again, this is August 2nd, 1881. Billy's just been killed. The newspapers are just finding out about it. What I find curious is, one, he says he went by McCarthy, which, of course, every newspaper article that mentioned Billy being shot by Garrett states that fact. However, very few stated that he was in Indiana, just the ones that quoted Wallace. Most of the accounts that included Billy the Kid's real name being McCarthy said that he was from New York. It usually was just a short blurb in a newspaper article that said, Pat Garrett shot Billy the Kid. His real name was McCarthy, and he was from New York. But here we've got Vandiver saying, he did go by McCarthy was here when he was here. But more importantly, he says he thinks that his mother never lived here, but at Indianapolis. And when we connect to the fact that the only sources we have of Katherine in Indiana are in Indianapolis, and we'll look at those coming up, I find it very curious that if he's just fabricating something or trying to get attention, then he's really taken a risk by saying Indianapolis, which, as folks have said, is quite a ways away from Terre Haute. If he was just going to make something up, he would pick something closer. So he must have found it curious at the time that Katherine, the boy's mother, was living in Indianapolis while the boy was in Terre Haute. And my question is, who was he living with? Was he at a school for boys, some kind of, school for juvenile delinquents, or just well paid for educational institution? What was going on there? Or did he have family there? Was there a McCarty family there, or a, someone related to his mother's side of the family? It's very curious why he would be there, but his mother would be in Indianapolis. And the fact that he arrested him 4 or 5 times, he says he detained him not for commission of any crime. So his use of the word arrested, I assume, is probably just more like detained or, took him in. And I did a cursory search of Terre Haute at that time in the newspapers, and I searched Vandiver's name, and it seemed like at the time he was dealing with a few young delinquents that he would bring in. A few articles talked about young kids causing trouble and stuff like that. So maybe Billy was running with that kind of crowd. But it's all just very curious to me that this much information is included in a little press release not even a month after Billy died, when most newspapers are saying he was a guy named McCarthy from New York. You've got this cop from Terre Haute going, yeah, I remember this kid in Terre Haute, and his mom didn't live here. She lived in Indianapolis, which nobody knew at that time. Nobody had any idea about Billy's mother, who she was, whether she was still alive or dead. And regardless of all that, nobody knew that she lived in Indianapolis at that time. We didn't know that until, the 50s or something, or maybe even later than that. So I just find it too coincidental that he hits the nail right on the head with Indianapolis. And I just can't overlook that, especially the August 1881 date. This is too soon for him to just be making stuff up or to be attention seeking. I think this, for me, is the strongest convincing evidence that he was in Terre Haute. But moving on, we have here the 1867 Indianapolis Directory. We have Katherine McCarty living at 385 North New Jersey. And she's a widow of Michael. Again, this is the only piece of evidence we have that indicates a possible father's name for Billy the Kid. Now, granted, he could be an illegitimate child. That could have been a stepfather, or, there's numerous scenarios that this could be. But ultimately, this is the only source we have for a father's name for a husband of Katherine. And it's not Patrick. And maybe it was Michael Patrick, but that's going to take more documentation. And for me, there's no other reason to believe that Billy's father was Patrick and not Michael. I think if we're looking for a records that link to Billy the Kid, we need to be looking for Michael McCarty and Katherine McCarty. But anyway, yeah, this is Katherine in Indianapolis, like Vandiver said, widow of Michael. And if you look in the same directory, William Antrim's not too far away. And now we have the 1868 Indianapolis directory. And we have Mrs. Katherine McCarty, widow of Michael. This time she's moved to 199 Northeast. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's a little closer to where Antrim is at this time. But again, widow of Michael. That's all we've got. And really, this is one of just about 3 or 4 hard documentations of where Katherine is and of anybody in the McCarty family before we get to Wichita and New Mexico. Well, really, these two are like the only hard documentations of any of the family before we get to Wichita. So these two directory, that's it. That's all we know. Katherine in Indianapolis, widow of Michael. That's all we got. But connecting that with Vandiver, we can assume that Billy the kid was in Terre Haute around this time. It's not, maybe he lived with Katherine in Indianapolis for a bit. I'm not sure, but it's possible that at this time, as his mother was living here at 199 Northeast, he was living at a school or with family in Terre Haute. This is the pension application of William H. Antrim, filed by the Department of the Interior in 1915. And he was in El Paso, Texas at the time. And if we scroll down, he gives information, about his life and his service, everything like that. But as we scroll down, he starts talking about his marriage, and was married in the Presbyterian Church at Santa Fe. I think it is on record in the church. Katherine was not married before. And when it asks information, he says he was not married before. I think, yeah. And then as it asks for information about his wife, he says, "This is not of my own knowledge. She was married to McCarty, date not known, died in New York City. Date not known. No other marriage, no military service that I know of." So here he's saying that Katherine was married before she married William Antrim to a McCarty. And we know from the city directories of Indianapolis, that was probably Michael McCarty. Also, a good piece of evidence here is I personally believe that Billy and Joe's father died in New York City, and Antrim attests to that here. So it could be surmised that both of Billy's parents went to Indiana. Or maybe they went to Indiana after Billy's father died in New York City. Maybe they had family in Indiana. It's hard to say. But either's possible at this point. But I'm putting a little weight behind Antrim's testimony here that the father died in New York City. And so the narrative that I've constructed thus far is Billy and Joe are born in New York to Katherine and Michael McCarty. And at some point, Michael McCarty dies in New York City, and they end up in Indiana. And perhaps Katherine is working in Indianapolis, or I don't know, trying to make ends meet, and she puts Billy with family or in a school in Terre Haute. I'm not sure. You would think there almost has to be a family connection in Terre Haute due to the distance between Indianapolis and Terre Haute, especially at that time. Or maybe she just wanted to put him in a really good school there. Who knows? But this is another really valuable document for the whole New York idea. That was just a close-up view of it. And so that's all that I have as far as screen shares go. But I do have a few more sources I'd like to share with you, if I can find my notes again. We've got the various newspaper articles. The one I shared from January 22nd, 1881, which said he was born in New York State, but his parents were moved to Indiana when he was quite small in thence to Arizona. We have another one from July 28th, 1881. Billy the Kid, who was recently killed by a sheriff of New Mexico, was an Indiana boy. And that's from the Goshen Times, Goshen, Indiana. Again, that was July 30th, 1881. July 19th, 1881, I believe I had a screenshot of this. General Lew Wallace said recently that the Kid was a native of this state, being Indiana, having lived for a time in Terre Haute. And that's from July 19th, 1881, the Indianapolis News. July 20th, 1881, he was a native of Indiana and formerly lived near Terre Haute. That is from the South Bend Tribune in South Bend, Indiana. And then 20 years later, 1900, Wallace says he was born in New York. And when a lad, he was brought to Indiana and was reared at Indianapolis and Terre Haute. That was printed in the Des Moines Daily News in Iowa. And then 2 years later, in 1902, Wallace is back at it, talking about his books and his autobiography. And he's talking about his midnight interview with the Kid. And he says, the man whose deeds of blood had drawn upon him the gaze of an entire nation was born a New York waif. Before he was more than 10 years of age, he was brought to Indiana. And in Terre Haute and Indianapolis, where he was raised, he was known as William Bonney. Now, I doubt that he was known as William Bonney that early. But again, from 1881 to 1902, Wallace never changed his story that Billy spent time in Terre Haute and Indianapolis and Indiana. Now, curiously, you'll find this next piece of info from the Billy the Kid Reader by Nolan. It's from a 1927 discussion that Maurice Fulton had with Susan McSween. And according to Sue McSween, she said that when Billy heard that Governor Axtell had been replaced by Governor Wallace, he told Sam Corbett that he and the new governor should, well, quote, ought to get real cozy since they were both from Indiana. And again, that's what, third hand? He told Sam Corbett, Sam told Susan McSween, and Susan told Fulton. But it's still, that's a 1927 transcript, I believe. I'd like to get my hands on the original, but that's another testament to the fact. It sounds pretty plausible to me that if Billy's from Indiana and he hears this new governor's coming in, this famed Civil War, I don't know if he's famed, but held in high regard, from Indiana is coming in. I could see Billy saying, well, we ought to get real cozy because we're both from Indiana. Again, just another Indiana reference. I thought that was very cool. And then there's a clipping from August 2nd, 1881. Again, I think that's the same day, actually, that Chief of Police Vandiver did his little interview about Billy. And this August 2nd one is from the Sun commercial in, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Vincennes, Indiana, Vincennes. And it says, the Terre Haute papers are claiming that Billy the Kid, the notorious murderer and outlaw, who's lately been shot by a sheriff in New Mexico, was a Terre Hottentot. Let them claim him. They don't want him. But again, that's cool because it says the Terre Haute papers are claiming that. And I couldn't find any Terre Haute papers from that time. And it would be cool to see if any libraries have that, to kind of see if we can find more mention of this. What if there's a paper from Terre Haute at that time that gives you tons of information? Yeah, we remember Billy. He was here because of this. His parents were this. It might break the whole thing open. And that's the kind of research we need to look into. Looking at, any kind of old school rolls we can find, or, anything past. I feel like digital research into this area is probably a little exhausted. We're going to need some boots on the ground. And our friend Jason tried that just recently, and I wasn't able to get with him. I wish I could have helped more with that, but we'll have to get him back out there. Um, and then another piece of evidence that I think is particularly strong is when Billy was captured at Stinking Spring in 1880. He was taken eventually to Santa Fe and placed in jail there. Postal Inspector Robert Cameron was researching and investigating the counterfeiting case. And, well, probably more so the robbing of the U.S. mails. That would make more sense. But he was in Santa Fe, so he thought he would stop by and interview the prisoners that Garrett had captured. And he interviewed Billy Wilson and Pickett and all those guys. But he also interviewed Billy the Kid. And he said he sent a dispatch to the Postal Service on January 11th, 1881. So, Billy is still around. Cameron just interviewed him, just talked face to face with Billy the Kid, and said William Bonney, alias the Kid, is held for murder. He's supposed to have killed some 11 men, but that is an exaggeration. 4 or 5 would be quite enough. He's about 21 or 23 years of age, born in New York City, and a graduate of the streets. So, to me, that's probably right up there with Wallace's testimony, Vandiver's testimony about Terre Haute. This may even be stronger than those, because this guy, not only did he speak with Billy the Kid, he just spoke with Billy the Kid. He wasn't remembering this in 1926. He wasn't writing a book in 1930. He wasn't, being interviewed in 1950. This guy spoke with Billy days before he sent this telegram to the Postal Service, and he said he was born in New York City. That's almost a case closed for me. We have all these sources, and I haven't even exhausted all of them. This is just all I could compile in a hasty attempt to provide you guys with a show on Sunday amid a flurry of frantic searching on the internet, just going off the top of my head. I mean, there's probably tons more references. I know, for instance, Josh found that article where George Coe mentions that me and Billy both had something in common because both of our dads died when we were 4 years old. Boom. That would put, again, if Billy was born in 1859 and Michael McCarty died when Billy was 4, that would put him right about 1863. If Joe was born in 1863 in April, then he would have never known his father. But what happened a couple months after April in 1863 in New York City? The draft riots. I think it's very plausible something happened to Michael in the draft riots. And I looked for this tonight, and I can't find it. It's somewhere in my notes, and I'll find the clipping for you guys. But there is mention in a New York paper. It's talking about those injured in the draft riots. And it says a man named Michael McCarty was seriously injured. I think it said he got hit with a club on the head. So maybe that's our guy. Who knows? Maybe someday we will know. But again, that's just, we keep finding these things. And how many times have we read that George Coe interview where Josh found that and just kind of glossed right over that? We might have to read the same record 100 different times before we, get it figured out. It's a long road ahead of us. I do apologize. I've been a little boring tonight. Again, it's, good Lord, it's 3:26 now, 3:26 a.m. The lighting's probably terrible. There's no sun coming in the windows. I'm rambling, in desperate need of sleep. But before I go, I do want to give you something fun in the way of speculation. We've got, I love documentation and research, and I love saying, we can't know this because there's no documentation, and we can't say this because there's no provenance, things like that. But I also love speculation, and it's fun. So if you guys haven't seen this, I want to show you a fun little this discovery I found. And again, full disclosure, I don't at the moment think that there's anything to this record. It's just the fun kind of stuff that you find while you're researching, and it just makes you scratch your head in perplexity at the nature of coincidence. But maybe there's something to it. Who knows? Could be, if someone wants to go out there and research more. But anyway, let me share my screen with you and show you what I'm talking about. Um, I think it's ironic that, as I'm researching in Indiana looking for McCarty's, I find this guy. His name's James J. McCarty, 33, born about 1827, born in Indiana, living in Shelby, Ripley, Indiana. I looked it up. That's about 2 hours from Terre Haute driving. So, I don't know. But anyway, his wife is Cornelia. Cornelia was born in New York. How was Cornelia born in 1832 in New York? How was she married to James McCarty in Shelby, Indiana? How did she end up in Indiana married to James McCarty when James was born in Indiana? So anyway, she's got a son named Henry. Henry was born about 1856 in New York. So we've got, interestingly enough, James McCarty, born in Indiana, married to Cornelia McCarty, who was born in New York, whose son Henry was born in New York. Well, that's interesting. So my thought is maybe, these are New York born McCartys. Maybe there's a family connection here. Maybe there's some kind of Indiana, New York pipeline for these McCarty relatives. Maybe this is the same clan. Cornelia's similar name to Katherine. I don't know. Just spitballing here and having fun. But what's even more fun is when you look up this is the 1860 census. When you go to 1870 and you look up James McCarty, Cornelia, I believe by this time, has passed away. He's married to a new wife, Mary, but Henry's still here. But do you know who's living with Henry? John Miller, age 14, born in Kentucky. So not only do you have New York McCarty's mysteriously married to a guy who didn't have Henry unless he'd moved to New York, you now have 10 years later a John Miller boarding with this McCarty family. And what an ironic coincidence, given our history with John Miller. I don't think this is our John Miller or our Henry McCarty, but it sure is fun to look at and to laugh at the irony of it all. And heck, who knows? Maybe there is a connection there. Maybe somebody researching can figure it out. But that's all I got, guys. I'm sorry I rambled. I'm sorry I was boring. I feel very monotone right now. I hope you cut me some slack. It's from 2:30 to 3:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, and I have to go to bed. And after doing 2 gigs today and having 2 rehearsals tomorrow, it's going to be a busy day and a busy week. But I wanted to give you guys something to listen to and to watch, and hopefully it'll give you some ideas to research and to look into. And one of my missions at Chasing Billy will always be to find out where he came from and who his parents were. I don't know why. That's just always been one of my driving forces. And maybe we can figure that out together. And maybe a few boring shows like this will help us get there. But at any rate, you've got something to put on and crank up the volume to, and clean your house or play solitaire or whatever it is you're doing on Sunday afternoon, here in about 12 hours. So while I'm rehearsing for a local production of Cabaret, I hope you guys are gathering and chatting and fellowshipping with one another, and keeping the thing going. And we will be back to our normally scheduled programming very soon. The idea is to have Doss in next week, and we will cover Garrett and cover, no doubt, tons of other stuff, and we'll get back at it. Thanks for bearing with me. I know I wasn't able to make last week and have to do a pre-recorded show this week, but we'll get back on track, and we appreciate y'all. So until then,